The night my son-in-law's hand closed around my daughter's wrist at the Christmas table, and his mother simply lifted her wine glass and turned away, I felt something settle inside me like ice forming on still water. Not rage, not fear, certainty. My name is Agatha Birch. I am 63 years old, and I live in the Glebe, a 10-minute walk from the Rideau Canal. For 27 years, I worked as a federally certified family court mediator in Ottawa. I have sat across from families in the worst moments of their lives. I have watched men describe what they had done in the calm, explaining voice of someone who believed they were the reasonable one in the room. I have watched women account for their own injuries with the particular exhaustion of people who have been rehearsing the explanation long enough that it no longer sounds like a rehearsal. I have watched children go very still when the temperature of a room changes. My entire career was built on one principle. You do not react before you understand the full architecture of what you are looking at. You observe, you collect, you prepare, and then you move. I never imagined I would one day apply that training to save my own child. My daughter Nessa was 31 that December. She had grown up in our house in Kanata with her father Angus, who taught high school history and believed that a person's opinions were only as valuable as the effort they put into forming them. He was not a loud man. He was a careful and deliberate one, and he raised Nessa to be precise where he was patient, passionate where he was measured. By 15, she was correcting his lesson notes. By 20, she was writing policy briefs that her professors forwarded to parliamentary committees. By 26, she had a position as an environmental policy analyst with the federal government, cycling to the office in Gatineau through the cold in a bright yellow rain jacket she wore like a declaration. She was not the kind of woman who needed anyone to make room for her. She made her own. Angus died suddenly 3 years before that Christmas. A heart attack on an ordinary Tuesday morning in February while he was scraping ice off the driveway before work. The kind of death that gives no warning and leaves no instructions for how to carry on without the person at the center of your daily life. Grief does something very specific to a strong person. It does not weaken their intelligence. It softens the walls they have never had to think much about, because no one they trusted had ever given them reason to build higher ones. My daughter was grieving her father when my son-in-law appeared. I have thought about that timing many times since. He was 38 when they met at a public consultation on a downtown development proposal Nessa had helped draft. His name was Piers, and he was in the room as one of the developers being consulted, which meant, under ordinary circumstances, he was there to be managed, and she was there to do the managing. He did something she told me about afterward with a kind of wondering warmth. He had read the entire report before the meeting. He asked questions that showed he had understood it. He mentioned a detail from the footnotes on page 43. She said she had never had anyone in that room. Read page 43. He called her analysis exceptional. He said he admired people who argued from evidence. He sent flowers to her office the following week. Yellow ones, to match the rain jacket. I want to say this carefully because I think it matters. He was genuinely engaging. Not in the polished, self-aware way of men who have studied how to seem appealing, but in the way of a person who had learned, painstakingly and over years, how to appear to be something he was not. There is a difference between charm and performance. I know the difference now. I should have recognized it then. I did not, and I will not pretend otherwise. The suggestions began quietly. They always do. "You work too hard," he would say, not as criticism but tenderness. "Your department doesn't appreciate what you bring to the table." He was not wrong that the federal public service could be thankless. She had told him that often enough herself, so when he agreed, it sounded like someone finally seeing what she had been living with. Those colleagues don't really have your interests at heart. Maybe the secondment to British Columbia isn't worth disrupting what we're building together. That committee position might put us in an awkward spot with some of my investors. You understand, don't you? Each sentence arrived softly. Each one removed something small. Nessa stopped cycling to work. He had concerns about winter road safety, and it was easier not to argue. She stopped carrying the worn CBC tote bag she'd had since university because he said it suggested a political leaning that was complicated for his business relationships. She declined a standing committee invitation in September. She told me it conflicted with a dinner he'd planned, and she'd reschedule. But she didn't reschedule, and when I pressed gently, she said the timing hadn't felt right. Her colleague that she'd mentored for 3 years stopped texting her on Friday afternoons the way she always had. Nessa explained it as distance growing naturally. I filed it. His mother, Thora, moved through all of it like a current beneath still water. She had organized charity galas and arts foundation boards for 40 years, and she never raised her voice in company because she had long ago learned she didn't need to. She would place one hand on Nessa's forearm at family gatherings and speak in the intimate register of a woman who only wanted what was best. Men like Piers need room to lead, she told my daughter once, directly in front of me. The way she said it made it sound like common sense. I recognized what it was. I said nothing. I filed it. I have since thought many times about what it cost me to stay quiet in that moment. I noticed the long sleeves in July. I noticed how she scanned the room before she spoke at his dinners. The fraction of a second she now took before answering any question directed at her. I noticed that her real laugh, the one that came from her chest and ended in a snort she had stopped being self-conscious about in her mid-20s, had been replaced by a smaller, more contained version that she used when he was in earshot. One evening in autumn, she arrived at my door without calling, ahead, the way she always had before. When she took her coat off, I saw the edge of a bruise below her left sleeve. The shape was unmistakable to anyone who had spent 27 years in rooms where those shapes were documented. She saw me see it. Neither of us spoke. I put the kettle on. When I brought the tea and set it in front of her, she looked at the cup for a moment, and then she looked at me. "He's under a lot of pressure," she said. I had heard that sentence 500 times in mediation rooms, in exactly that register, with exactly that quality of managed exhaustion behind it. I recognized it the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years. Not consciously, but in the body first. "I know," I said. I let her drink her tea. What I understood that night, sitting across from my daughter in my own kitchen, was something I had known professionally for decades and had somehow failed to apply at home. Control does not announce itself as danger. It arrives as devotion. It looks exactly like love until you look at it from far enough outside. And by the time it turns physical, the person being harmed usually already believes the harm is something they caused. I had waited too long. I would not wait any longer. The Christmas dinner was at their house in Rockcliffe Park, in the kind of neighborhood where old Ottawa money sits behind mature hedges and brick. that has been well maintained for generations. My son-in-law had done very well in the years when Ottawa's housing market climbed beyond what most young families could reasonably imagine, and the house was something Thora referenced often. Nessa had prepared most of the meal. When I arrived, the table was set with a precision that had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with dread. Every napkin folded the same way, every glass at the same angle. I had seen that kind of table before. It is set by someone who is afraid of what happens when something is wrong. Nessa met me at the door and held me a beat longer than usual. She was rigid in the way of someone who has been holding themselves together by sheer will and is not sure how much is left. Dinner began pleasantly. My son-in-law was gracious in his host role, as he always was in company. Thora held the conversational floor with ease, moving from the neighborhood to the new development near the glebe to observations about how this generation confused busyness with purpose. She said several things I noted with care, the way I once noted testimony. Partway through the meal, Nessa reached across to refill my plate with the gravy. She was closest to it. Her hand was not entirely steady. The ladle caught the edge of the gravy boat on the way back. A small, brief sound, nothing spilled, nothing stained, and the table went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when they are already waiting for something. My son-in-law set down his fork. He looked at her the way I had seen men look at women in mediation rooms. Not angry, because anger can be witnessed and documented and named, but with a deliberateness that communicated everything anger communicates and left no trace of it in the room. "Are you going to do this all evening?" he said, quietly, pleasantly enough that it could be explained away. Nessa opened her mouth and did not speak. He stood slowly, with the particular unhurried quality of a man who is making a point with his body, and he reached across the corner of the table and closed his hand around my daughter's wrist. Not in a way that would alarm a stranger, in a way that looked like a husband holding his wife's hand. But I could see the angle of his grip, and I could see the muscles in his forearm, and I could see the exact moment my daughter stopped breathing. Thora set down her wine glass with a small, precise click. She looked at Nessa with something beneath the surface of her expression that I recognized as satisfaction. "A good hostess doesn't let her nerves run the table," she said, in the warm, advisory tone she reserved for lessons. "You've had 2 years to learn how this family dines, dear." She lifted her glass again and turned to ask me about the weather. I sat in that room and I was perfectly still inside it. I did not speak. I did not stand. I found my daughter's eyes across the table. She found mine the way people find the exit sign in a dark and unfamiliar building automatically, before thought catches up. And I held her gaze for one moment. Long enough for her to understand that I had seen everything. Long enough for her to understand that I was not going to pretend I hadn't. Then I smiled at Thora and said it had been a mild season, all things considered. Because this was not the moment to act. This was the moment to understand completely what I was dealing with. Before that evening was over, I had recorded in memory the words spoken, the people present, the precise sequence of events, the quality of Thora's composure when her son's grip was visible to anyone paying close attention. I drove home through streets that were beginning to ice over at the edges, and I sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time. I knew what I was looking at. I had known it professionally for years, in the files of dozens of families. I also knew what happened when people like my son-in-law were confronted too quickly, too loudly, too emotionally. They had time to shape the story first. They had time to ensure the person they had harmed looked unstable. They had time to turn truth into something that needed defending. I was not going to give him that time. There was one call I had been holding back, not for a client, not for a case. A Crown attorney I had known since my early years at Legal Aid Ontario. A woman I had worked alongside through some of the most difficult files either of us had carried. I called her that night and told her enough. She told me what I needed to know about documentation, about evidentiary patterns, about what a history of incidents required before it could be made visible in a way that could not be managed or explained away. She did not tell me what to do. She trusted me to know. That call changed everything, though it would be weeks before I understood exactly how. I started documenting dates, observations, specific language, the pattern across 2 years of things I had noticed and not named. I was building a foundation before I built anything on it. 3 weeks after Christmas, they moved. Not visibly, subtly, the way people move when they have done this before. A colleague, Nessa, had trained and mentored through 3 projects, stopped responding to her messages without explanation. A professional reference she had counted on for a departmental nomination sent a vague note suggesting she was overcommitted at the moment. A complaint appeared with my former professional association, anonymous, carefully worded, suggesting I had used my professional contacts to interfere improperly in a private family matter. It was designed not to destroy me outright, but to occupy me, to suggest unreliability, to shift the conversation from what I had witnessed to whether I was the kind of person whose account of events should be trusted. I had seen this strategy used in mediation proceedings many times. Discredit the witness. Make the truth need defending. Nessa called me in February. She sounded the way people sound when exhaustion has finally worn through resolve. She said maybe she had been framing things too dramatically. She said peers had apologized. She said she was tired of everything feeling like a confrontation. I listened to all of it. Then I said, if you go back to the way things were, it will be quiet for a while. She went still on the other end of the line. And then it will get worse, I said, because they'll know they can wear you down. She cried for a long time. I stayed on the call. I didn't tell her what to decide. I knew that her choosing was the only thing that would make what came next something she could carry through to the end. The message arrived at 11:40 on a Thursday night, while I was sitting at my kitchen table with a book I was not reading and tea I had let go cold. No subject line, no preamble. Just a sentence. I worked in that household for 8 years. There are things you need to see before they take everything from your daughter. I opened the attachment folder slowly, alone in my kitchen with the house quiet around me. There was audio first. A woman's voice, Thora's, measured and precise, using the same pleasant tone she brought to dinner parties, speaking to someone she addressed as family. She was explaining, with the patience of long practice, how to manage a wife with too much independence. She used the word manage comfortably, the way you use a word you have never needed to be careful about. She described isolation as a technique and talked about how professional setbacks were particularly effective because they felt personal in a way that was very useful. She laughed once, a small, private sound. There were emails going back further than I expected. Thora writing to people in her social network about my daughter before the wedding. She called Nessa strong-willed in a way that made the phrase sound like a structural flaw. She wrote that the situation would require early handling. She wrote that her son had a pattern of needing guidance in these situations. And then there was the document at the bottom of the folder. A court record from another province. A divorce proceeding my son-in-law had never mentioned. I had not known it existed. The case had been resolved quietly, in a city far enough from Ottawa that no one in his current life had thought to look. There had been a protection order. There had been documented incidents. The summary page remained in a public index that Thora apparently had not realized was searchable. He had done this before. His mother had known. I sat with that for a long time. The woman who had sent the files wrote to me the following morning. Her name was Frida. She had worked in Thora's household for 8 years and had been let go without a reference. After she asked too many questions about a woman she had seen crying alone in the guest bathroom at a family gathering. She had kept copies of certain documents, she told me, because she had watched from a distance what happened during the first marriage, and she was not prepared to watch it happen again. I was afraid for a long time, she wrote. I hope it isn't too late. It was not too late. I called my Crown Attorney colleague with the full picture. What followed over the next several weeks was not quick, and it was not straightforward. There were formal interviews, there were statements given. There were conversations I waited outside of because they were Nessa's to have, not mine. She was the one who had to decide what she could carry forward and what she was prepared to say out loud. She decided she would say everything. I drove her to a meeting with a family law lawyer near the Rideau Center on a gray Tuesday morning in March. She was quiet for most of the drive. As we turned onto the street, she said, almost to herself, I forgot what it felt like to make a decision without first checking whether I was allowed to. I did not respond, I just drove. She was in that office for 2 hours. I sat in the waiting area with a Tim Hortons coffee that went cold in my hand, and I did not look at my phone. When she came out, her face had the quality of something that has been held very tight for a long time and has just slightly begun to release. There was a separation. There was a protection order obtained under the Family Law Act. When my son-in-law's legal team received the scope of what had been gathered, the documentation, the audio, the records from the prior province, the pattern they mapped across 2 marriages, the narrative he had been managing began to lose its footing. The story about the unreliable wife and the interfering mother was considerably harder to maintain when the evidence was this specific, and the sources were this varied. He violated the protection order. Once was sufficient. He was arrested on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, it was in the public record. Thora's position on her Arts Foundation board received a quiet letter from people who had reviewed the content of the audio recordings. She resigned before the board had to make any formal request. The image they had built, the respected developer, the woman of consequence, did not collapse all at once, but it cracked where it had been built on silence. And once something built on silence begins to crack, there is no rebuilding it. 4 years have passed since that Christmas. Nessa lives in a 1-bedroom apartment in Hintonburg, the neighborhood she had loved before she moved away from it. She is back at work. She received a departmental commendation the following year. She has resumed sitting on a standing advisory committee, not the same one, a different one, But the point is, she is in the room. Her analysis is in the room. Her voice is in the room, and it sounds like hers. She cycles to work again. She bought a new yellow rain jacket last spring from a shop on Wellington Street, without asking anyone whether the color was appropriate, without imagining that the question had any bearing on her life. She told me recently that the first time her current partner raised his voice in frustration during an ordinary disagreement, he stopped himself mid-sentence, took a breath, and said, "I'm sorry. That's not how I want to speak to you." She called me afterward and told me she had sat with that for a long time. Just sat with how different it felt. She said it felt like someone opening a window in a room that had been closed for too long. I wrote this down because I made a promise to myself that I would not let it disappear into the kind of polite silence that protects no one. Not for Nessa, who is still learning, as we all are after something like this, that she does not need to earn the right to her own life. Not for the women who reached out after I shared part of this story elsewhere. Women who recognized the long sleeves and the careful laugh and the very particular silence of a person who has started editing themselves in order to survive in the company of someone they love. Not for the mothers who wrote to tell me they were afraid to ask the question they already knew the answer to. Freda is doing well. She found work she is proud of. I think of her more often than she probably realizes. My son-in-law is no longer any part of our lives. His mother is no longer any part of our lives. The system of reputation and social connection that had shielded them was not dismantled loudly. It was taken apart through patience and documentation, and the specific courage of a woman who eventually chose to say what was true, out loud, to the right people in the right room. There are 5 things this experience made clear to me. I say them plainly because plainness is the only thing worth offering. The first, control does not arrive as a threat. It arrives as concern, as protection, as love. It looks reasonable until you stand far enough outside it to see the shape it has made. The second, the moment you realize someone is being harmed is not always the right moment to act. Preparation is not passivity. Timing is strategy. Choose your moment. The third, people who build their safety on reputation guard that reputation more carefully than almost anything else. Documentation is not just evidence, it is the thing they are most afraid of. The fourth, leaving requires time, and it requires a kind of internal permission that no one else can provide. You can stay close, you can stay steady, you can make sure that when the person you love is ready, you are there and they know it. The fifth is this: if you are watching someone you love become smaller, and you cannot quite name what is causing it, trust the part of you that cannot name it. You already know. The question is only whether you will act before the cost becomes irreversible. If any part of this sounds like your life, if you recognized the long sleeves, or the checked laugh, or the person who used to argue for the pleasure of it and has slowly stopped, please say something to someone, a friend, a colleague, a crisis line, a woman you trust. It does not matter who, as long as you say it out loud, to another human being in real words. Your voice is not a liability to be managed. It is the most important thing you have, and it was never theirs to take.